In Chapter 16, we're going to look at the respiratory system, and specifically we're going to look at pulmonary ventilation or breathing. So we'll just look at an overview of the respiratory system and a little bit of the anatomy in this lecture. The respiratory system has a lot of functions. Obviously, it's there for gas exchange, and it's also really important in helping to regulate the blood pH, which we'll see in the next chapter. It protects respiratory surfaces by humidifying and warming incoming air and removing any pathogens or dirt that you may have breathed in. It's also needed for smell, producing sound, because you have to force the air out past your vocal cords to talk. And then it also has the respiratory pump, which remember we talked about that in Chapter 14. So when you exercise and start breathing faster, that's going to increase the venous return to the heart, which will increase the end diastolic volume, the amount of blood that you fill the ventricle up with. So it stretches the ventricle more, and that'll make it contract harder, increasing the stroke volume, which will increase cardiac output or blood flow, and that will also increase the mean arterial pressure. So why do we need to do gas exchange? We need oxygen to make ATP, and remember the mitochondria do that, and they do that via a process called aerobic respiration or cellular respiration. We also need to get rid of the waste product carbon dioxide. And remember, carbon dioxide comes from your food. So as you break your food down to release the energy to make the ATP, the carbon in your food gets exhaled as carbon dioxide. And respiration is the process of gas exchange, and we divide it into external and internal respiration. External respiration involves everything outside of the body cells. So it involves pulmonary ventilation or breathing, which is what we're going to cover in this chapter. And then also it covers gas exchange between the lungs and the blood, gas transport in the blood, and then gas exchange between the tissues and the blood. Internal respiration is what's going on inside the body cells, and that's where your mitochondria are making the ATP. So they're using the oxygen and generating carbon dioxide as a waste product. So that's aerobic respiration or cellular respiration. The anatomy of the respiratory system, we divide it into two parts, the upper airways, which includes the nose and the pharynx. Remember, the pharynx is the back of your throat area. And then the respiratory tract is going to extend from the larynx or your voice box to your lungs. And we divide the respiratory tract into two functional zones. So we have the conducting zone, which goes from the larynx to the terminal bronchioles. And it's just going to be conducting air in and out of the lungs, and there's no gas exchange occurring there. And then the respiratory zone is where gas exchange does occur. So that's in the respiratory bronchioles and the alveoli. And then here's just a picture of the anatomy of the respiratory system, the two parts. We have the upper airways, which includes the nose, and the pharynx, which is the back of your throat area. And then the respiratory tract, which extends from the larynx all the way down into your lungs to the alveoli. This picture shows the upper airways. The nose is very important for warming and humidifying the incoming air. It also will trap pathogens and debris that you've breathed in through the mucus and the nose hair. And then the nasal conchae, these scrolls of bone, create some narrow passageways for the air to pass through. And that creates a lot of turbulence in the air and shakes out the larger pathogens and dirt that you breathed in. And so then that just gets trapped in the nose hair and the mucus. And then here we have the back of the throat area. This is the pharynx. And then if you look just a little bit below here, you can see the trachea is on the anterior or the front part of your neck. And here's the epiglottis. So this little triangular piece of tissue will close and cover the opening of the larynx here when you swallow, and that will prevent any food or drink from going down into your trachea. And then right behind the trachea is your esophagus. So let's take a look at the conducting zone, which extends from the larynx down to the terminal bronchioles. Here's a picture of the larynx. The glottis, or the opening to the larynx, is right here. And on either side you have the vocal cords, which will vibrate and produce noise. And then right here in front we have this triangular piece of tissue, that's the epiglottis. So when you swallow, the epiglottis will flip up and cover the opening to the larynx, and that'll prevent the food and water from going down the trachea. You can't see the opening to the esophagus because it's collapsed, but it would be right above here. And then this picture over on the right just shows the epiglottis, this triangular piece of tissue here, and then you can see the larynx is open. So as you inhale and exhale, the opening of the larynx will get wider as you inhale, and then as you exhale it gets smaller. So you actually can see that opening and closing as the patient is breathing in and out. And this picture happens to be from a cat. I couldn't find a picture from a human. Here's the front side of your larynx, and you can actually feel that on your throat. That's your Adam's apple. And then notice that there are cartilage rings along the trachea and down the bronchi. The cartilage rings are there to help keep the trachea and the bronchi open so they don't collapse as you're breathing in and out. Notice that the tracheal rings are not complete. So on the back side there is some smooth muscle and no cartilage there. And that's because your esophagus is right behind your trachea. And so as you swallow maybe a big chunk of food, you need to be able to expand your esophagus, so that's why there's no cartilage there. So that gives room for the esophagus to expand. And then as we go down from the trachea, we're going to branch into the right and left bronchus. And the right lungs have 3 lobes, whereas the left lung only has 2 lobes. And that's because the left side has less lung tissue, because notice there's a notch here because your heart is a little bit more shifted over on the left side, and so there's not room for 3 lung lobes on the left like there is on the right. So here just shows how the trachea branches into the right and left primary bronchi, and then those will branch even further to the secondary bronchi and then the tertiary bronchi, and then they get down to the bronchioles, and then finally to the terminal bronchiole. The other thing I want you to notice about this picture is that the cartilage rings that are in the trachea and around the primary bronchi, as you go down into the secondary and tertiary bronchi, they get smaller, so you don't have rings anymore, you just have these cartilage plates. And then by the time you're down to the bronchioles, there's no cartilage left. This is just a picture of a respiratory tree. They just dissected away all of the tissue except for the bronchi, bronchioles, and they've just injected it with dye so you can see the different structures. And then this table here, I want you just to notice that as you go further down into the respiratory tract, the diameter of the airways decreases. The cartilage decreases, the tissue thickness decreases, and the smooth muscle increases. So by the time you're down here in the bronchioles, there's a lot of smooth muscle in there, so you can bronchodilate or bronchoconstrict if you need to. So functions of the conducting zone, remember that it's there to conduct air into and out of the lungs, and there's no gas exchange going on there. It holds about 150 mils of air, and we call that the dead space volume. And that's just because in that volume of air that's in the conducting zone, there's no gas exchange going on. The conducting zone is also important because it warms and humidifies incoming air before it gets to the air sacs. And then it also is going to trap and remove most of the pathogens and dirt that you breathed in. So one of the ways that we remove pathogens and dirt that you breathe in, there are some goblet cells that secrete mucus, And these epithelial cells that line the trachea and the bronchioles, they have cilia on them. And the cilia will beat and form this mucus escalator. So any pathogens or dirt that you breathed in will get trapped in that mucus, and then the cilia will beat and move those up to the back of your throat, where you either will swallow that or cough it out. And this is just an electron microscope view, just showing you the cilia in those airways.